All right, so these are the rules and guidelines you're going to use for your projects in here, because the International Science Fair, which is sponsored by Society for Science and the Public, probably has the most complete setup for this kind of stuff and has the most complete set of rules. I mean, they're very easy to read. They're very, very easy to follow, okay? An adult sponsor is defined in the rules, okay? They're the person who's actually helping you make sure you get everything done. All the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, and so forth. A qualified scientist, if you're working in a university setting, you probably have a qualified scientist. And that qualified scientist may be your adult sponsor, or Dr. Terry or I may be your adult sponsor. Okay? You have to have an adult sponsor form filled out and signed. You only have to have a qualified scientist form filled out if you're working under a qualified scientist and doing your research. Okay? Designated supervisor may be somebody completely separate, or that might simply be your qualified scientist, your adult sponsor. Okay? Sometimes you don't need a designated supervisor, but in any event, you will have somebody supervising your work. It is not allowed that a high school student do research work without some kind of adult supervision. Okay? And these all cover sort of different categories. The Institutional Review Board is one that, if you're working with people at all, even if you're just handing out surveys and compiling answers, you have to have your research plan approved by an IRB. And we are setting up one here. I've got part of it set up. I've still got a little more work to do. Okay? Hopefully by Monday we'll have it all nailed down. All right? And so if your research plan is finalized and you are working with people at all, then you need to go for an IRB. Okay? Which means you need to have your research plan printed out for every member of the IRB. And they go through your research plan. You meet with them, and if they looked over your research plan, they have no questions, they sign on the bottom line. Well, actually, there's 3 places they have to sign, but they sign off on it and you're ready to go. All right? If you change anything, whether you have to have IRB approval or not, if you change anything in your research plan, anything, okay, you've got to have prior approval before you move forward. Does that make sense? All right? All right, Scientific Review Committee, we'll deal with that when we have to deal with that, but most likely in the reports I've seen so far, the plans I've seen so far, we don't need that. However, on the IRB, if you're working in a college or university, or you're working in a professional setting like in a business or industry where they're doing some kind of research, and you're doing your research there or under their supervision, they should have an IRB. Okay? Now, there are certain circumstances where they don't or aren't required by the law to have one, but if they don't have one, then whatever your research is has to be approved by an IRB here. Okay, if you're working with people at all. Does that make sense? So you can't start your research until you have IRB approval. So if you are working in a university setting or a college setting, the first thing you want to do, the next time you meet with your research project mentor, is to ask, has your project been approved by an if you're working with people, has your project been approved by an IRB? Okay? If it hasn't been approved by an IRB on that campus or at that facility, then your project will have to be approved through this IRB. Does that make sense? All right. Now, what does an adult sponsor do? An adult sponsor is the person who kind of oversees everything. Okay? They make sure the student knows about the rules and guidelines. So we're about through with this textbook. We are in Chapter 11 right now. You're taking the quiz on Chapter 11 right now. Okay? Most of what this book covers the kind of things you see in the International Science and Engineering Fair rules. Okay? When they come up, I've tried to bring them to your attention in here. It would be in your best interest if you were to go to the ISEF website and read through the rules yourself and find those things that apply to you. Okay? Now, if you're not working with people at all, there's no reason to read those 3 pages that deal with human subjects. Okay? But if you're working with human subjects, that's what you need to know about. That's your responsibility to know about it. You need to read those 3 or 4 pages that apply to working with human subjects. Okay? So go through the rules and make sure you've read through them. Okay? From time to time, I'm going to go through some things like I am today. All right, we'll go through some of the forms that you're going to need that I know some of you are going to need. The adult sponsor is the person who's responsible for making sure you're aware of risks associated with the project, okay, and that we have minimized those risks. In some cases, there are risks for which we won't let you do that project. And I haven't seen anybody's research plan where that's come up here this year, but it's come up in the past. You know, there are some projects as a student you just can't do. All right, you can't inject people with drugs. All right, that's just not allowed for a high school student. Okay, but now you can work with people, but in a very minimally invasive sort of way. What I say invasive, that really more applies to actually sticking somebody with a needle. You can't invade a human body, period. All right, but working with them in terms of giving them surveys, that's reasonable up to a point. Because if you have surveys that could emotionally harm someone, you know, the way that you got it set up, that's not allowed either. Okay, but that's part of my job, Dr. Terry's job, is to work with you and make sure you don't have that problem, so that when you get to an IRB, it's smooth sailing. We're going to try to make sure that happens. But now, you got to understand, people on the IRB have different viewpoints, and that's the point of having an IRB. They may have questions that didn't even occur to me or Dr. Terry. Okay, so you need to be aware that you may have to go back and do some more work on your plan after you meet with an IRB. Okay, or the IRB. And one of the things I'm doing today is this next bullet here, making you aware of forms that are required for the project. And every project is going to require about 4 forms, and some of you will have to do 5 or 6 forms. The adult sponsor is responsible to make sure that you have proper supervision during experimentation. Okay, you're not allowed to do certain things by yourself. And if you are allowed to do certain things by yourself, it's that adult sponsor's responsibility to make sure that you know what you can do by yourself and what you can't. So if you're doing water testing, for example, and I sent an email out about a possible project that involves some water testing possibly, you know, it might be just fine for you to go to the edge of this pond or creek or whatever it is and, you know, take samples of water. All right? But if you have to do some higher level testing with that in a lab, well, for that you're going to need adult supervision right there in front of you. Okay? So that's part of Dr. Terry's and my job, is to make sure that you know, or in the case where you're working with a scientist or a professor at a college or someone else in a business or an industrial setting, is their responsibility, if they're your qualified scientist, if they're supervising you, to make sure you know what you're allowed to do and what you aren't allowed to do. Okay? Having said that, it's still a good idea for you to know what you can do and what you can't do. Okay? Especially if you're told. You know, one of the problems we've had in this class from time to time is, you know, we told people stuff and somehow it goes right over their head. And it's really important. You're at the point in time where we just can't have, you know, you guys are the cream of the crop here at Dolman High School. You should be able to remember this stuff. Okay? If there's any question at all, ask. Okay? And we talked about submitting projects to an IRB or an SRC. All right. And usually the teacher serves as the adult sponsor. And I think for most of you, except those working in a college lab or something, that's going to be the case here. All right. A qualified scientist. We talked about the sort of definition for that. It is required for some kinds of projects. And some of the projects some of you have already submitted, you're doing projects under a college professor for which you have to do it under a college professor. It's not allowed to do it any other way. A qualified scientist, if they have a doctoral or professional degree related to the area of research you're working in, that's fine. All right, that's pretty much all that's needed. If they only have a master's degree, however, and I shouldn't say only a master's degree, that's what I have, okay, then there are certain situations where working with them in certain projects requires this review committee review first, okay? And I haven't seen that the case here because I think all of you working in a college are working with somebody who has a doctorate. So I think we're okay there. The biggest thing is that IRB proposal, okay? And there are some forms to fill out. It's called Form 2, Qualified Scientist Form. That's what QS here means here. All right, is anybody working with live animals or animals that you're sacrificing for use in your research? Okay, I don't mean sacrifice like in some religious thing. Come on, Adam. All right. Huh? Huh? Well, they're not here today. The two people I know of where that might come up aren't here today, so we'll get to that. I'll get to that with them, okay? All right. Yes. Sacrificing, yeah. All right, look, just so you know, sacrificing isn't some religious ceremony thing, okay? It just means, guys, sacrificing is a term that's used in science research to mean that you have to have, the animal has to be destroyed, okay? People hate to hear the word killed, okay, but that's what it means, all right? All right. That's enough. All the guys are laughing right there, and the girls are all wincing. No, that's very typical. I shouldn't do that. Just kidding. Okay. Huh? All right. Did you say you're wincing too? You're crying? Oh, okay. All right. Anyway, that's just a term that's used, okay? It's not a ritual thing. It just means it's killed for a purpose. All right? All right. Other than eating it. What? Oh. All right. Yeah. Okay. The designated supervisor then is responsible for overseeing what you're doing. This is somebody who knows what they're doing working with animals, or knows what they're doing when it comes to doing this sort of thing. I might not even, maybe I shouldn't even mention this, but there was a story on the news here this week about some lady who had dead cats hung up around her home. She claimed she was doing some kind of scientific research. That's not allowed, okay? Just so you know. All right, if you saw that story. All right. Yeah, it's pretty gross. In fact, the news station that was running the story said they purposely blurred the video so you couldn't see the stuff out there. That's pretty bad. Okay. So here's the point, or one of the points anyway. Unnecessarily killing an animal is just not allowed. It's unethical. Okay? So unless it's necessary, we don't do it. And if it's necessary, it must be done in as humane a manner as possible. Okay? And you know there are organizations that don't think there's any reason at all to kill animals. Okay? You understand that. All right? And so it not only is it strict under federal guidelines, it's even more strict under International Science and Engineering Fair guidelines. Okay? You have to have a solid reason for doing so. All right? You can't do it alone. It must be done under the supervision of this designated supervisor. Okay. So they supervise projects that require a qualified scientist. So let's say you're working in a lab, and the qualified scientist, the doctoral level professor who's there, is not there every day. Okay? But you're working under a lab superintendent, or you're working under a research assistant. Okay? That's a designated supervisor in that case. But there may be other cases. All right? The rules cover a lot of different things, and if you're working in a college lab somewhere or university lab somewhere, then you just need to know what that term means in that situation as it applies to these forms you have to fill out. Okay? You may have to have that research assistant fill out a form for you. Okay? Depending on how it's set up. I've had conversations with one particular research plan supervisor, or your mentor, one of your mentors where that situation occurs. Okay? He's not there every day. And so he leaves you under the supervision of somebody who knows what they're doing, because they've been doing it a while. They're your designated supervisor. Okay? All right. So if the qualified scientist cannot directly supervise you, then there has to be someone who is doing that. Okay? If you're working in a project where a qualified scientist is required, adult supervision is required at all times. All right? All right. So here's the qualified scientist form. It's fairly simple, but it has to be filled out. It has to be signed. You don't fill these out in pencil. All right? They're permanent records. All right? What? Qualified Scientist Form 2.